Hello, students. This is part two of the progressive movement in the United States from 1890 to 1920. I want to talk more about this slide again that was a part of part one. And these are already filled in on your packet. Improved safety conditions. That was something that progressives and reformers pushed for to make sure workers are safe in factories. They have the proper equipment and wear for them to endure the heat in a steel plant or the close proximity or closeness of a coal mine. So those are some examples of safety conditions. And I talked to you earlier about the Triangular Shirtwaist Factory, which was a tragedy that led to 130, 140 women's deaths in New York City. They couldn't get out. And from that time period after that and on to now, that's why we have fire drills. We have fire exits and doors open inside towards you so people can escape and get out of danger from a fire. Reduced work hours, and people worked long hours where they were stressed out physically and mentally and away from their families. So a lot of labor unions and progressive reform people push for reduced work hours. There used to be an AFL song that went 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. And so they were calling and asking for or singing in that song for shorter work hours. There were placed restrictions on child labor, and child labor was a negative effect of industrialization. Children as young as 5 years old and 10 years old attended their families and factories and plants to work and to provide for their families. Children were tied to machines, children were whipped, children were mistreated, and children were prevented in many cases from going to school. So there are laws now, because of the progressive movement reforms, that say that an employer cannot hire anyone below the age of 14. In fact, you have to have a worker's permit if you're 14 and 15 years old. So they cannot interfere with education of a child. In fact, children are small and vulnerable as 3 to 10 year olds working in a factory, because all that dust and all that smelt and all that, those chemicals in those factories are very hazardous, not only to adults but also children. So there are safety mechanisms. I can't say that word. The safety mechanisms put in place to make the life of the laborer safer and to restrict child labor. Rise of labor unions. I already told you about that. You had the AFL-CIO was the first labor union established by Samuel Gompers and Steve McBride and other people who pushed for better pay, better working conditions for workers of the same trade. In some states and in some companies, you're required to be part of a union. Even though you're not part of a union, you still can earn some of the benefits like better pay, workers' comp, safer working conditions, and make sure you're not mistreated by your boss. And then you have the aftermath of the Homestead strike in 1892. The women's suffrage movement played a big role in the progressive movement. Women's suffrage means the right to vote. It also involved increased education opportunities, which led to more girls and women to stay in school and go to college. Many people believe that women weren't as smart as men, and that's an idiotic and stupid way to think. And that's not true. There's no scientific evidence to prove that. Some people even thought, some religious leaders and some business leaders and some men in general, and even some women, married women or single women, believed that if a woman tried to vote or go to school, it's going to cause her health problems. It's going to cause her not to be able to have children. So those are erroneous and silly notions that people had. and along with that, attain voting rights. Women gained the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. That was ratified and passed in 1920 by the Congress and the states. I don't think Virginia ratified or approved of the 19th Amendment, but it's there. It's etched in stone. It's not going anywhere. So the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. And what inspired suffragettes and women who fought for women's rights to vote was the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote regardless of color or previous condition of servitude. So that amendment, the 15th Amendment, inspired women to fight for the right to vote. So if men can vote regardless of the color, then all women have the right to vote. Like I said earlier, Susan B. Anthony and let me go back here. Sorry. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton worked for women's suffrage. Others, such as Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and Jane Addams, fought for gender equality as well. So not only women fought for the right to vote, also men. And Woodrow Wilson was a great supporter of women's suffrage. He wasn't a great supporter of African American equal rights, so I just want to add that point in there. Another aspect of the progressive movement is that there was another movement inside of another movement. It was called the temperance movement. Temperance means you calm down, you make things peaceful, you get things under control. And that it was made up of groups led by women and religious leaders who were concerned about drunkenness and moral decay in society. And they were opposed to the making and consuming of alcoholic beverages. You had people, preachers, women, churchgoers, and people who were against people drinking and selling alcohol go through saloons and with axes and hammers, busting up beer bottles and liquor bottles and telling people how awful and terrible it was to drink. So that was a part of that time period. And this led to the support for the 18th Amendment. This amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which banned the manufacture, sale, distribution, drinking, and purchasing of alcoholic beverages. It led to organized crime, bootlegging, speakeasies. Speakeasies were illegal drinking clubs, and they were secret clubs where people can buy and drink alcohol. And people had a special knock or special code to get into these speakeasies. And bootlegging got its name from people smuggling beer illegally in the country or across state lines or in towns and cities. My great-grandmother bootlegged whiskey. Yeah, she was a bootlegger. And organized crime was a problem because people believed that if the government makes all these laws against alcohol, people are going to break them. And there's an old expression that says, rules are made to be broken. Okay? So, organized crime, bootlegging, and speakeasies were effects of the temperance movement, which is also called prohibition. And that lasted until like the 1930s. And it was gotten rid of or repealed by what it says for letter G, the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment was later repealed. You go back here. Was later repealed or canceled because the government cannot enforce or keep people from buying, drinking, and selling alcohol. And the 21st Amendment ended prohibition and replaced the 18th Amendment. Remember, a good way to remember is that 21 is the age to buy and drink alcohol. 21 is the age to drink and buy alcohol, and that applies to today. Okay, so you're going to have to do some type of foldable or some type of worksheet that talks about the 18th, 19th, and 21st Amendments to the Constitution. And I'm going to discuss that at another point in class. So, you had the rise of labor unions, and this is just another detailed review of what I talked about labor unions earlier. A labor union. You have some questions here. It says, "What is a labor union? And what are other factors labor unions? What are some other factors that led to labor unions in the 1800s and early 1900s?" Let me read that again. What other factors led to labor unions in the late 1800s to the early 1900s? Just tongue-tied here. A labor union, again, is an organized group of workers who strive to improve safety, benefits, wages, and rights for workers. The AFL, which is called the American Federation of Labor, that was the first major labor union in the United States. That was formed in 1890. That ended in 1955. It's now called the AFL-CIO, which is a merger of two labor union groups, and they still play a role today in fighting for benefits, better pay, short work hours, more work holidays, more benefits for workers in any field, particularly if you work in a factory or any type of industry. You had strikes. Strikes are where workers refuse to work because they are not treated fairly by their bosses, or who are the employers and employers of the company. So that's part two of the progressive movement. It's not very, to many people, it's not a very exciting time period, but there's a lot of change socially, economically, politically, and industrially to help poor people, immigrants, minorities, women, and people who are basic workers. So feel free to go back and listen to part two again to get a further understanding of what this time period was about. There was a lot of turmoil during this time period. You had a lot of race riots in cities like St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit, because a lot of African Americans went up north between 1890 and 1920 to find better jobs and better opportunities, also to escape the ills and negative aspects of segregation, which was discrimination. And you had a poor southern crop like the cotton and tobacco that failed, and also to run away from the KKK. So that also happened during the progressive movement. And there's a town called Tulsa, Oklahoma, and in the early 1900s there was a race riot based on a law, but not based on the law, but based on the lie that somebody said about an African American, what they did, and government officials and racists burned down a place called Black Wall Street, where African Americans owned a lot of banks, a lot of businesses, a lot of corporations, a lot of stores, very wealthy. That was burned out in the early 1900s. It was a horrible time. Thousands of African Americans were killed. So I wanted to share that with you, that happened through this so-called progressive movement. So anyway, I'm done talking, and thanks for listening. Have a good day. Peace.